right, folks, we're just letting a couple people in. Welcome, guys. My name is Trevor Ramos. I'm the author of How to Get Free Money for College, and we're doing a webinar today on how to get into law school, as well as any scholarships, financial aid offered to students who want to get a JD. I have an amazing colleague, Hanna Stotland. Hanna is an expert on this process, and I'll let her kind of explain to you the depth of it all. But I'm really excited to have her on here. And without further ado, Hanna Stotland. Welcome, Hanna.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to see you, and thanks for being here, and thanks to Trevor for having me. And I'll start by talking about my own background, because all of my specialty areas within higher education counseling were outgrowth from my own experiences and my own problems that I had to come up with solutions for. So I ended up becoming a higher ed counselor indirectly because I flunked out of high school. And I'm based here in Chicago. I was going to a private high school here, and I had all kinds of complicated personal problems, but also this weird misplaced rebellion where I thought it was like civil disobedience to refuse to do my homework. I thought I was like a conscientious objector to high school. So I got straight Fs, even though I had been an A student. I got straight Fs my last 3 semesters, and didn't think I was college material, didn't want to go, didn't think I could go. My parents said I had to get a GED and a job, so I did, and I started working at a minimum wage type job on my 18th birthday. And I worked for 2 years, and over that time I got better in a lot of different ways and decided that I wanted to go to college, but I had no idea who, if anyone, was going to take me with that kind of record. I was hoping to go to a 4-year school if possible and not have to transfer. And I was initially denied everywhere I applied. I ended up, there was one school I applied to, which is a small women's college in Pennsylvania, that was willing to have a fight with me about the denial. And they eventually put me on the wait list, and they accepted me, and I went off to Bryn Mawr College. And when I got there, I discovered that I was really good at college, and I felt I had the potential to love it, but I did not like being at a tiny women's college. And so I started applying to transfer. And after my freshman year, I was denied everywhere I applied as a transfer. But after 2 years at Bryn Mawr, I went through the whole process for a 3rd year in a row. And this time I got into Harvard, Stanford, and Penn. So I transferred to Harvard as a 22-year-old junior, and loved it, thought it was amazing. And right away that first summer got a job in the admissions office, giving tours. And there's a spot in the tour script for any of you in the audience who have been on these tours before COVID shut them all down. There's a spot in the script where you say, "And this is what brought me to Harvard." And I would tell a short version of this story, and people were not at all expecting to hear this from their Harvard tour guide. And so after every tour, it seemed like some family would take me aside and say, "You have to talk to my nephew. He just got out of rehab and he wants to go to college. Can you help us?" And I didn't know what to say. I was like, well, here's my email address, right? This is in the summer of '98 now. And so people started bringing me hard admissions cases, kids who had been dropped out, flunked out, kicked out, expelled, suspended, sent to rehab, arrested, all kinds of serious admissions problems. And because I was so happy at Harvard, I stayed there for law school, became a law school counselor for students at Harvard College while I was a student there. And that was my first experience as a volunteer, that the grad students are paid in food, given free meals in the undergrad dining halls to sit with the undergrads and talk to them about how to get into grad school. And I had a 6-year legal career here in Chicago, but I was always doing this on the side and hoping when I grew up someday to be a full-time educational counselor. After my 6 years in legal practice, I spent 5 years as an administrator at Northwestern University School of Law here in Chicago. And in 2013, and again, I was always seeing my own clients on the side, but since 2013, I've had no day job, and I have solely been working with my own independent client families who are either applying to law school with or without some crisis management component of their cases, and working with freshman and transfer college applications, mostly with students who have something difficult to explain or some problem on their record. So that's my background, and my philosophy of law school admission is that good law school admission counseling is inextricably tied together with legal career counseling. That if you're doing this task well of helping people plan their legal education, from the word go, which we're at the word go right now, from the word go, you should be thinking about what is the career that I want, where in the country do I want to practice this type of law, what is the match between my legal career goals and the opportunities I'm going to have coming out of the law schools that I'm going to be competitive to get into. Because a recurring theme today is going to be that law school admissions is pretty predictable compared to college admission. You can't know for sure what's going to happen, but if we have your undergrad GPA as generated by, there's a process that's more or less like the Common App, but for law schools. They will generate your GPA from your undergrad school only, and they will express that in a standardized way so that it can be compared across schools. That GPA and your score on the LSAT, which is the SAT, ACT of law school admission, that's going to determine about 90% of the likelihood of whether you're going to get into a particular school or not. So there are all kinds of other factors that we can talk about that are going to play some role at the edges. But overall, the GPA and the LSAT scores are going to determine your fate. And because law is a very hierarchical profession, there's a strong sense of who is ranked where, and which law schools are more preeminent than others, and which types of law firms and which practice areas. All of those things have a prestige value that is largely agreed upon across the profession. And what that means is that to a much, much greater degree than with undergrad, where you go to law school is going to follow you for the rest of your life, and in some cases determine whether you have a chance to join a particular practice area within the legal profession at all. This is just not true for undergrad. And we often push back, we meaning higher ed professionals, often push back on the assumptions that families come in with that, oh, I need to go to Harvard for this job, and otherwise the doors won't be open to me. That is much overstated. It's much exaggerated in the college context. If you go to, and I will, I use fictional schools as examples. I imagine, The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, all the Who's live in Whoville. If you're going to Whoville State College, right, or maybe even West Whoville State College, the regional school, if you do outstandingly well there, and you have big aspirations for what you want to do with that degree, there's nothing that you can't do coming from East Whoville State College. If you are successful, if you're someone who gets your work done and does it well, you're smart, you're well organized, those kids are gonna do great in life. There are certain things that are easier for them if they get into Princeton, wonderful. But there's very few things that Princeton kid can do just because he went to Princeton that the East Whoville State grad can't do. Law school, different story. There are large groups of employers and entire areas of practice that are more or less closed to you based on where you went to law school. And I don't think that that's rational. It's not, none of this is that I'm describing is anything that I agree with. In fact, I don't know anyone who works in law school admission who thinks that this overwhelming focus on GPA and LSAT is a good way to run a law school. But there are all kinds of external pressures that push them into operating this way. And so my job as a counselor is to let my students know and let you know whatever I perceive about the system the way it is right now, good and bad. So Trevor, are there some themes you'd like me to move on to? Or actually, I'd love to know, I see everybody's muted and has your photos down. That's okay if that's how you want to be, but I would love to hear from anyone who feels comfortable. I'd love to see you if you're comfortable with that, or just hear from you and hear what are the, we're a nice small group now. We can have a conversation rather than you just listening to a lecture. So I'd love to hear where you are in the process. Are you a college student, parent of a college student? And what are the themes that you want to learn more about and that you'd like me to emphasize?
Hey folks, before we do, I just want to let everybody know we are recording this webinar. So if you don't want to be on the recording, just use the chat function. But we'd love to hear any questions.
Yeah, I'll look at the chat too.
Background.
But if you don't mind sharing at least minimally in the chat, if you are a parent or a student or prospective student yourself, and where in the education process you or your child are right now. Thinking about law school way in the future, or is this something for next year? It's a little bit like Netflix, so say, is anyone still watching? I hope so. Hi, Augusta. Thanks for saying hello.
Yeah, while everybody's doing that, I did have a question. So, you mentioned thinking about your area of practice before actually applying. Are there concentrations that are tougher to get into for law school than others?
So this is a really interesting contrast between law school and undergrad. Law school, there are some schools that offer what they call concentrations, who would say, okay, well, you want to do intellectual property law, and here are, we'll give you a certificate in that. For the most part, legal education is pretty uniform across schools and across fields. I mean, when my father was a law student, and he was part of the class in 1964, when he was a law student, there were no elective classes. Maybe something in your final year you would have a couple of choices, but for the most part there was a curriculum of courses that every lawyer was expected to master, and there wasn't any freedom. Now it's the opposite. The curriculum is mostly electives, but you don't graduate ever with a degree, at least for the JD degree that we're talking about here, where most people mean when they go to law school. There's no such thing as, well, I got my degree in intellectual property law. You get a JD, and all the JDs are treated equally in terms of your academic focus. And you can do a certificate program, let's say in immigration law or family law, something like that, that is your area of interest while you are studying, but the degree is exactly the same. And for the most part, you don't have to declare any particular interest on your way into law school. So many colleges, they'll be asking you, are you applying to the engineering school or to the nursing school or the School of Arts and Sciences? And law school doesn't work that way. There's just one on-ramp, If you know what you want to do, it can be helpful to your application to talk about that. Say, here's how I plan to use the resources of your law school. I want to practice family law. I want to help families with adoptions. Here's my experience that I've had in that field. That's fine, but it's not required. Super. So Augusta's asking about scholarships. We've got some parents and some current students, as well as a financial advisor, which is wonderful to hear from, who wonder if law school is worth the money. Especially given that people aren't always certain that they're going to practice law, and this is a huge investment. So let's talk about money. So to start with, the upfront sticker price is very, very high. The actual tuition is going to be, in all likelihood, around $40,000 a year and up. Your cost of attendance could easily be $70,000 or $80,000 a year. And in contrast, again, to college choices, there isn't any equivalent to community college, or really there's little parallel to public schools with low tuition that's affordable to most families. There are public schools, and you may get some kind of a tuition break for being from that state, the way you would, if you're a Chicagoan applying to the University of Illinois. But for the most part, the range of sticker price is going to be from really high to insanely high. That's the only range. It is, most people borrow almost all of the cost. And for most students, that's going to be anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000. And that would include the cost of living, as well as the cost of tuition and books and so on. So we're talking about a gigantic investment, a really serious decision about whether you should put, as long as you're not in California, you could get a house for or at least a condo for what you would be putting in. Plus, there's the 3-year opportunity cost, where you probably can't work very much, or probably shouldn't work very much if you can help it, while you are a full-time law student. There are part-time programs, some of them pretty good, that enable you to have a full-time job, and then you do your law courses at night and on the weekends, and typically it would take you 4 or 5 years to graduate in that part-time program, as opposed to 3 years in a full-time program. So that can be a really good option for folks who have either a job they really value, or a job that's paying them well and allowing them to live. And you can go to law school at night. You just have to be ready for the fact that that's hard, right? I want to show a lot of respect for anybody who's able to do that, because speaking from my experience as a full-time law student, it is you can easily and wisely spend 60, 70 hours a week on full-time law school. You don't necessarily have to, but it's probably smart to do that if you want to have good options after graduation. So yeah, be aware. And especially, if you have a spouse, kids, somebody like that who deserves your time and attention, just don't underestimate what a challenge you're taking on. Law school is hard under the best of circumstances, and part-time work while you have one or more other full-time jobs. And I know people who have done it with a 40-hour-a-week job and raising kids. It can be done, but those people are a lot tougher than I am. And so if you're ready for that, that is often a good way, especially for someone who's maybe a few years out of college and has earned a pretty good place in their career, whatever they're doing. That is a way to make the money work. That is often so that you can minimize loans in a way that may not be possible for a recent college grad who is going to law school full time. So that's the important thing to know up front, is we're talking about a ton of money. And of course, we should think about, when we're talking about borrowing all of that money, which is what most people do, right? There's a fraction of folks whose parents are able and willing to pay for this for them, which is wonderful. If you're in that position, God bless you. You're very fortunate. Go get your law degree and then give back to the community. If you're in the large majority of folks who are not in that position, then you're going to be thinking about, how can I do this to make sure that I am not drowning in debt for the rest of my life, that I'm taking wise, careful debt that I've thought about well. And so there's several ways of thinking about this. So number one, there are law schools that are a little bit cheaper, usually not, it doesn't get them into the realm of affordability unless you're Bill Gates, but there are, you might, if you're from Alabama, the University of Alabama is quite a good tier 1 law school. And it is not as expensive up front as some of its peers. So that's one thing to consider. Are there schools with a lower sticker price? That does exist. It's just not as dramatic as it is in the college context. Next thing to think about is, where can I get in? There's a reason why, even though this is about paying for law school, I had to start with, how do law school admissions work generally? Because once you understand this very hierarchical, we have a sense of that these schools rank above this group, above this group, above this group. You have to know that that ladder is there, and that it is determined, your place on that ladder is determined by your GPA and your LSAT score. You have to know that in order to then see, often so is the actual price you'll pay is also determined by where you rank on that ladder. And we can imagine, let's say you're someone who has the potential to get into a very elite law school like Harvard or the University of Chicago. That same student can probably get a pretty big discount if they come down here to, let's say, Northwestern or Georgetown, which are still outstanding law schools, but they could probably get a nice discount. Well, what if you want to go to law school for free or get, a full tuition scholarship? Now you're going to have to go down another couple of rungs to find the place where these schools are willing to charge you nothing in order to entice the student who by numbers belongs up here. These law schools will give you a huge discount to recruit you to come to their law school instead. And this relative ladder is exactly the same whether, let's say, Harvard or Yale is at the top of that span of ladder that you're looking at, or maybe a second tier, very good, but second tier law school like Chicago, Kent, all right, might be, suppose that's the best type of law school that you might be able to get in with your numbers, then who's down here? Then maybe I can get a big discount to go to DePaul, and maybe I can go to John Marshall in Chicago for free. It's my father's alma mater, is John Marshall Law. So thinking about what span of that ladder your numbers grant to you gives you usually a fair amount of freedom about where in this span do you want to be. Do you want to borrow a whole lot of money and go to Kent, where you have a better shot perhaps of getting the job that you want and enough of a shot at getting the earnings that will help you pay back that enormous debt? You want to try and balance that and go to DePaul and say, this is still quite a good school, but not as good, and they gave me a discount? Or do we say, I don't want debt at all, I'm going to go to John Marshall and live at home, or have a whole bunch of roommates and come out free and clear? So there's a question in the chat. Did you say earlier that going to a second or third rung school will limit your future earnings options and earnings? Yes, it can. And that's why these types of problems are difficult. And I can't tell you, here's the equation you should enter. Here's the equation you should calculate to determine which of these law schools you should go to. your tolerance for the debt, your aspirations for your career, how snobby your legal ambitions are. All of those things have to go into the mix of weighing whether Kent at full price might actually be a better deal than John Marshall for free, depending on what you want to do. There is absolutely no question that the kids at Kent are going to have more options than the kids at John Marshall. I think of them as kids. I'm old enough now. Many are in their 20s or 30s, but they're at the beginning of their legal career, so they're kids to me. So thinking about this, and there are some very admirable and fulfilling legal careers that are in less snobby fields of the law. So for example, let's say, and I'm using Chicago just as because it happens to be where I live, but this can be true anywhere in the country. Let's say I want to be a public defender in my county court system. That is a job that pays a living wage. It wouldn't make it easy to service, $200,000 in debt, but you can have a good solid middle class income at that job. And that is not a particularly snobby employer. If you have a good record at John Marshall, or certainly at DePaul, and you interview well and you work hard, there's every reason to think you can get that job. And if that is your aspiration, then it might be quite sensible for that person to save a lot of money and go to John Marshall. And that is both realistic for the career that they want, right? You want to be looking at, so suppose I get a lovely offer from John Marshall, I should be looking at, and they should be telling you, they shouldn't be hiding the ball on this at all. They should be telling you, yes, we have graduates working at employer X, employer Y, employer Z. And this is why it's so important to have as much information as you can about where you think you're going to want to go, because you should be weighing these law school offers and scholarship offers that come with them in light of, do people coming out of that law school get the job that I want in the city that I want? Is there a resource for the ranking of law schools? So US News is the ranking when we're talking about this. There are other rankings that can be useful for more granular questions. Like suppose you're really, really focused on a particular area. For the most part, you shouldn't be saying, oh, well, I'm going to go to John Marshall because they're really well ranked in intellectual property. That may be true, but if you get into DePaul at the same price, you should go to DePaul and not to John Marshall, even if they don't have that intellectual property ranking, because this is just a higher ranked law school across the board. Those other rankings are more important, or can come into play if you're analyzing something very specific to you, or if you are comparing schools that are US News peers, right? Like, let's say you're deciding among Columbia, NYU, and Chicago, right? You're a very, very accomplished student and you got into those schools, which are in some order ranked 4, 5, and 6. So clearly top 10 schools. If you're deciding among them, then looking at things like, well, who has a recognized program in international law? Well, that's, at that point, that's very valuable. You just don't want to be, if there's a big gulf in US News ranking, that is more important than the relative rankings on the schools on any other single criterion.
Yeah, and it's this is awesome. So these are begging a couple of questions. First is, when you're talking about the jobs that everybody wants fresh out of law school, What are we talking about? We talking about mergers and acquisitions? Like what fields does everybody want to go after?
So it feels like everybody. I want to push back a little bit on the way you phrased it is the way most people would, right? I mean, there's, especially because we're talking about schools where you come right out of law school and your starting salary will be, let's say, $170,000 a year. Right? You're going to have a lot of takers for that job. And so it feels like everybody wants that. So you should evaluate, are you part of everybody? You know, maybe you would rather have a job with better work-life balance. Or maybe you have this passion for, you know, you want to put the bad guys in prison. I want to be a prosecutor and I want to work for the US attorneys and put away drug kingpins. All right, then you're not part of the everybody that wants to go after the money. But the money is there and lots of people want it. Those jobs tend to be jobs at the big firms. And there are many fields of law practice that are offered by those giant firms. And the giant firms have anywhere from, let's say, 100 to 1,000 lawyers, usually have many locations around the country, often abroad as well. All right, the firm that I worked at is definitely considered a big firm. It's not a huge one as those things go. When I was there, it had 4 US offices. Then there are colossal firms that are more like, you know, that you can compare to an employer like Ernst & Young or something like that, where they have lots and lots of locations and thousands of lawyers, and they hire hundreds of law grads every year. There are many fields within the practice of those big firms. So mergers and acquisitions is a big one. Basically, what those big firms do, to the extent that you can summarize it at all, because they're very diverse. But what they do is they are the lawyers to corporate America. So anything, let's say you're, to name a big client based here in Chicago, United Airlines. If you're United Airlines, you have lawyers that work internally that are part of your internal firm. And largely what they do is supervise and work with the armies of outside lawyers who work at law firms who United Airlines is going to hire every year. So what kinds of problems does United Airlines have that these people will be helping them with? So I was a litigator, right? This is what litigators are, people who deal with disputes. When you have gotten into a fight with someone and you're either threatening to go to court or you're actually in court, that's what you do. So the kinds of things that I would work on is Sprint is suing MCI, which was a thing then. Let's say Sprint suing AT&T, saying, you agreed to sell us these 10 cell towers and then you reneged on your deal. I'll see you in court, right? That's the kind of thing that I would deal with as a litigator. Litigators are actually in the minority. So we think, because the lawyers on TV are almost always litigators, whether they're criminal or whether they're business lawyers. Most lawyers are not litigators, mostly are not threatening or getting ready for court or being in court. Most are doing things like corporate structuring, right? So they say, all right, we United Airlines are going to have a subsidiary that's going to protect us from, from taxes in such and such state, and we're going to create a subsidiary, right? They have people who do tax law and say, how should we, how do we explain our income and outgo in ways that minimize our tax exposure? And there's going to be hundreds of people doing that for a big firm. Mergers and acquisitions, okay? United wants to buy Air Wisconsin. Lawyers deal with that. All kinds of, there are people who do contract negotiation. So United wants to buy 100 747s from Boeing. That's going to take that's like a years long project to write and negotiate all the contracts of well, what I'm going to pay you X amount for Y products, and then I'm going to we have to write we have to compose these contracts that are going to cover every possible scenario so that we don't end up in a court battle. Like, what happens if your parts from China don't arrive because there's a pandemic? I'm going to write that into the contract. What we're going to do in that situation, we'll have to negotiate that. So all kinds of behind the scenes things. An area like finance, we want to offer some debt to the country, to purchasers. How should we structure that so that we can borrow money as United Airlines and in the most favorable way? So there's lots and lots of fields, many of which I don't know very much about or really understand. But that is what those big firms do, is deal with the legal problems and potential legal problems of corporate America.
I have a follow-up question, Hannah. So that kind of begs the second question I was going to ask, kind of what this kind of decision they're proposing, which is, if I want to be a federal judge, do I need to go to a tier 1 law school?
Boy, okay. So this is, and Trevor, I don't think you know this about me, but I actually did a research project on this issue. Actually, my last year of college before I started law school, but I was working under a retired federal judge. The answer is, if you are a federal judgeships period, but especially federal judgeships, because federal judges are not elected. They are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So for the most part, the voters don't know or care what's considered a fancy law school or not. So if you're running for a state judge, circuit judge in Cook County, Illinois, there are lots of people out of John Marshall who have that job. If they're good at the politics of getting elected, right? That voters don't care, like, oh, blah, blah, I went to the University of Chicago. They don't know what that means. Federal judges, totally different story. And that is a super, super snobby area of the profession. And so absolutely, you want to go to a tier 1 law school, or if you are going to complete your career in a particular location, going to the best or dominating law school in that area can be a really good way to get started in your career there, including for fancy things like a federal judgeship. So let's say you want to spend your legal career in Kentucky, and you get into the University of Kentucky. It really doesn't matter whether people in New York are impressed with the University of Kentucky. That's how to get ahead in Kentucky. And so that might be a good plan. Federal judges writ large overwhelmingly went not just to tier 1, but to top 10 and top 3 law schools. Until this year, all 9 people on the Supreme Court went to either Harvard or Yale Law, right? We just got our first justice, who is a Notre Dame law grad, which is a top 25 law school, decidedly tier 1. But that's it. And I can't see everybody, but based on the research project that I did 20 years ago, and I don't think this has changed very much. If you are a person of color, it will not be surprising to anybody to hear that you have to, the phrase has become a cliche because it's true, that you have to work twice as hard to get and be twice as good to get half the credit. That's true. Black federal judges overwhelmingly went to Harvard and Yale. If you look at federal judges across the country, there are many Harvard and Yale, other very good law schools like Georgetown, places like that, and a good, strong representation by places like University of Kentucky, University of Oregon, in the states where those are the dominant law schools, not the Black judges. The Black judges went to Harvard and Yale.
So then I had another question. So is there any area of law, if you want to practice, that a JD is not enough? Because I run into a lot of tax attorneys and they usually have LLMs. Is that necessary?
So tax is a special case. It's often necessary in tax, or not necessarily I don't want to say necessary, it's often valuable in tax to do an LLM is a master's degree in law, which you do after the JD. It's a 1-year program. They are offered in many, many fields. And my personal opinion is in most of the fields that aren't tax, these are a way for the law schools to make more money. All right, for the most part, even on very interesting areas, they may be well taught. That's a different issue. But is it a career boost that's worth another year of $50,000 or $60,000 worth of tuition to do an LLM in international human rights or in family law or you name it? Probably not. Tax is pretty special in that area where the LLM, I can really say there's a return on investment of getting that LLM.
Can you teach with a JD?
Yes, most people who teach law school, most tenured professors have only a JD. There are some law schools that hire a lot of people who also have a PhD, like Northwestern Law, where I used to work. But the standard traditional path to becoming a law professor is just to have a JD and then to have publications in legal journals and to clerk for the most elite federal judges, particularly those on the Court of Appeals and on the Supreme Court. And that is the traditional route to becoming a law professor.
So these clerkships are they right out of college?
So, sorry, this is one of my favorite topics. My primary responsibility at Northwestern was helping the students get judicial clerkships. So you occasionally hear about these on the news during the, let's say, hearings for someone who's been nominated to the Supreme Court. Sorry, I inhaled some tea and I can't. Give me a moment. Outside of the legal profession, for the most part, people don't know that law clerks exist or what they do, which is fine. Within the profession, they can be very important, especially if you want to go into a snobby field of law. Like if you want to be a federal prosecutor, if you want to be a judge, if you want to teach, you want to work at one of these fancy firms. The clerkships and particularly everything is ranked. In this case, unofficially, there isn't a publication where I can look up the prestige of a particular judge or a particular court, but everybody who's in the circle, they already know. So federal clerkships go primarily to students at top 10 or top 14 law schools, and hugely disproportionately to kids coming out of the top 6 and especially the top 3 and especially top 1. Yale Law is the most selective law school. They usually have a federal clerkship rate between 50 and 60%. So basically everybody who wants a clerkship coming out of Yale can get one. And the only reason that people don't is, well, some people are really interested, either in a hurry to get to the money, or they actually think they are going to enjoy working at the big firms that hire them, and they go there because they're in a hurry to get started on the core of their career. At Harvard, then maybe it's 25 or 30%. Most people who want to clerk can, not everybody. You get a little further down to a Northwestern or Georgetown, maybe it's 10 or 15%. And outside of the top 20, right, there's going to be a handful in each class who will get a clerkship, and they won't have the opportunity to be snobby about which judge or which circuit. You know, if you're at Harvard or Yale, we're going to be having these conversations about, like, there's this United States Supreme Court at the top of the federal judicial system. Then there are 13 federal circuits below that, those are the courts of appeal. Every location in America belongs to one of them. And there's a pretty strong pecking order among people who aspire to these, of a sense like, sure, he got a Court of Appeals clerkship, but it's only in the Eighth Circuit. He didn't get DC Circuit or Second Circuit, which is New York, Ninth Circuit, which is California. There's all these fine gradations. What matters about the clerkships, and this is one of the rare things where we're talking about all this stupid prestige ranking and the hierarchy and all of that, the substance of the clerkships is amazing. It's wonderful. I think this is the best job in the profession. What the technical title of a law clerk is elbow clerk, because traditionally the idea is you would be at the judge's elbow. It is a 1 or 2 year apprenticeship at the elbow of this very eminent senior legal thinker. And what the clerks do, everything behind the scenes. You would see the judge sitting on a bench during oral arguments. Everything that they do back in their office, they do collaboratively with the clerks. The clerks read the briefs from both parties. They prepare the judge. They think through the legal issues and do research on them. They brief the judge. They tell him what we think. Both judges I clerked for were women, but they tell her, here's why party A should win and not party B. Here's the case law that would define this. And we also typically get to write first drafts of the opinions that become the law. So it is an incredible, and there's a multi-century tradition of respectful, professional closeness between clerks and judges. It is usual for the judge that you clerked for to marry you when you get married. I was married by the first judge I clerked for. Typically, there are reunions every year where you would come back at Christmas time or whatever and see that your judge has a body of former clerks who become an important part of your network in the profession. People you can go to for advice will include not just the judge, but all those other clerks before and after you. And in general, those of you who were, you may have seen at Justice Ginsburg's funeral, when Justice Ginsburg was lying in state at the Supreme Court, there was a very beautiful and to a lawyer's eye, very moving assemblage of her clerks from her very multi-decade career. All of her clerks came back to both be pallbearers and to stand at the side of her casket, and they spent the night in the lobby of the Supreme Court with her casket, or was it the Capitol? I can't remember. Anyway, they ritually sat by her side when she lay in state. So that illustrates for you the kinds of almost parental bond between the clerk and the judge, ideally, and how this can transform a career. Then once you've finished your 1 or 2 years, then your clerkship becomes a credential. And lawyers, when a lawyer dies and they were a federal clerk or from a state Supreme Court, their judge's name will be in their obituary. Like, that's how important this is 50 years later to their colleagues in the profession. So I could go on for hours about clerking. It's wonderful. People have just general themes. Doesn't have to be a specific question. If there's just a concept or a theme you want to throw out for me to riff on. People interested in talking at all about the LSAT and LSAT preparation?
So what's the target LSAT score for like a top tier law school?
170 is the LSAT is scored from 120 to 180, which is a rough parallel to, for those of you who took the SAT, from 200 to 800 on each section of the SAT. So that the median score is meant to be 150, 180 is perfect, and 120 is the lowest score. 170 is a pretty bright line in the sand. For people who are likely to be competitive at the top 14 and those who are not. There can, if you have a 399 GPA, then you can get away with a lower LSAT score and still have a shot at many of those schools. But that is a typical, if you can get in the 170s, let me put it this way, law schools will pay for that score. Law schools are, they live and die on these rankings. They have to attract the LSATs and GPAs that are going to maintain their place in the US News rankings. So they are more or less graded on the GPA and LSAT of the class that they enroll. So if you can put together a great LSAT score, law schools will pay to, that's really what they're doing when they're giving the merit scholarships. They will pay you to come to their law school.
And do you get, like, say if you get a scholarship from these schools, do you get it before or after you accept the decision?
So the scholarships that we're talking about from going to a lower ranked law school, those are going to be upfront. They're going to make a deal with you. Our tuition is $60,000, but for you, 15, as long as you maintain such and such a GPA. There's also a different kind, if you're a very fortunate, hardworking student who has a great GPA and LSAT score. The most elite law schools, for the most part, don't give that money because there's no one who they think sort of outranks them. There's no one who they think we have to sweeten the deal to attract you away from our competition that's ranked higher than us. If you're Yale, you don't have to do that. What they do instead is, if you aspire to a low-paying legal career like government service, or if you want to do some kind of advocacy like working for the ACLU, or if you want to do direct civil legal services. So for example, I know folks who are doing amazing work down on the US-Mexico border, and they are lawyers they are funded by grants. Basically, they work for charity organizations, and they'll be in Nogales or wherever and volunteering to represent immigrants at the border who are claiming asylum and who don't have anyone to represent them. And with very rare exceptions, people in America who are in civil rather than criminal proceedings do not have a right to a free lawyer. So even if you are very vulnerable and there's something very personal at stake, like you're being evicted from your home, or child services wants to take your children away, you have no right to free counsel. So if you get a lawyer, it's because basically a charity provided one for you, a private charity. So if you want to work like that, the law schools think that's wonderful. They want their graduates to go on and do work like that. But they know, if you're going to be doing this in Nogales, maybe they're paying you $40,000 a year. And there's no way that you can service $150,000 worth of debt while you're making that kind of income. And so for those most elite schools that give no or very little upfront scholarship aid, they have loan repayment programs. So they say, okay, come here to the University of Chicago or to Harvard, borrow the cost. When you're working in Nogales, we'll pay off your loans for you. So as long as you are working in that low-paying legal job, your law school is committed to cover your loans. If you decide to quit, I'm going to go and work for, fancy law firm in New York, then they stop paying your loans for you. But this is a very, very powerful incentive, I think, to do the best you can to get into the schools at that tier, where either you will get that big firm job and you'll be able to handle your loan repayment without a problem. Or if you want that lower paying mission-driven job where you're doing charity work, the school will pay your loans for you.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. So actually, I want to switch gears a little bit before we hop off. You also do crisis management. And I had to look that up because that was the first time I ever heard it expressed that way. But can you explain to the folks on what crisis management is?
It basically means you hit some kind of wall in your education, or that's affecting your education. Could be a medical crisis, could be a grief crisis, right? So I've had clients, for example, who were in high school and their mom died. So they failed all their classes that semester. That is an educational crisis. And when they apply to college, they're going to have to put that in context and say, no, I wasn't, just blowing off my courses to play video games. Here's what happened to cause that dip in my performance. And this is especially challenging for students who are aspiring to either medical or law school, because both at the entry level, where you're applying to be a first-year law or medical student, and at the exit level, when you are applying to be a licensed professional, at both of those stages, there are character and fitness requirements that you have to meet, not just academic requirements. So when you graduate from law school, you're going to take the bar exam in a certain state, and that will earn you the right to practice in that state. But you don't get to sit for the bar exam just because you graduated from law school. You have to graduate from law school, and you have to pass a character and fitness inquiry where they decide, okay, they're going to, and it is a very searching background check. You have to list, even if you're 40 and had, years of experience after college before you went to law school, every employer you ever had back to being a camp counselor when you were 16. You have to give contact information for them, and they will call them. Every place you ever lived, including summer share during summer before sophomore year of college, right? All of that, they will contact your old landlords and say, does she owe you money? Was this person a responsible tenant? In some states like Virginia, they give you, you have to list 6 friends who will vouch for your personal character. If you have ever had parking tickets, you have to disclose them all, pay them off if they're not paid off. So this is a very, very searching issue. And also any kind of academic trouble that you've been in, we're accused of cheating, whatever, going back all the way to high school. So I had to petition to be permitted to sit the Illinois bar because I had flunked out of high school, even though I was applying 9 years after high school had ended. And in the interim, I was about to get my second Harvard degree since the disaster happened in high school. And I was rather bitter about this at the time, kind of still am, where I was like, how many Harvard degrees does this person have to get around here? Because apparently the answer is more than 2 in order to do penance for these sins I committed in high school. It's ridiculous. But they told me I had to petition, and I bent the knee and I said, yes, sir, right away, sir. I was very naughty and I'll never do it again. And you have to do that, because the bar in any state is not messing around. And one of the worst things that can happen is that you borrow a bunch of money to go to law school, and either for character and fitness reasons, they don't let you sit the bar, or you fail it and you're allowed to take it multiple times. It's only offered twice a year. And in the meantime, you can't practice law. So that is this happens to thousands of students every year. They put 3 years and $100,000, $200,000 into the process of law school, and they can't pass the bar. And that is a bad, bad situation to be in. You don't want to be in that situation. And even if you think, well, I'll go back to my old career selling insurance or whatever, you're often at a disadvantage being hired for a non-legal job because you have a law degree. A lot of employers will think, well, we're her sloppy seconds. She doesn't really want to be here. The minute someone offers her as a job as a lawyer, and she's going to be out of here. So it doesn't, I think folks often imagine, well, more education is better. And from a point of view of developing your brain, that's true. From a point of view of your career, it's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to make sure that people understand what I was saying here.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a niece or nephew or anyone in college that has been expelled or that had to take a leave for any particular reason, when they reapply to another school, they will have to explain that. And that's actually how me and Hannah got connected, is because I was dealing with someone in that situation. And this is the kind of work that Hannah does. She helps this person to explain and figure out what their options are. And so, yeah, that's just so you know, this is the person, like nationally, the person that you want to talk to if you know someone in that situation. But I'd like to kind of, so what do you do to help people as far as law school admissions? Because we'll probably do another webinar just on if you got kicked out of your college, what are your options and all that. But what do you do to help people to get into law school and to make the decisions and prepare them?
Step one is, if I'm going to help you with law school, I want to be humble and upfront with you about what I can and cannot control. I'm roughly saying about 10% of the outcome is not controlled by your LSAT and GPA. So we're only working, me and my law school counseling client, we're only working in that 10%. Now, if you're right on the bubble of whether you get into the school you want or not, that 10% is a big deal, right? Think of it as the difference between getting an A and getting a B. That can be a big difference. But need to understand that the LSAT and the GPA run the show when it comes to law school admission, and not pretend like I can work miracles, because nobody can work miracles in law school. There are some miracles in undergrad. Like, I consider my own admission to Harvard College, even 20 years ago when it was easier, I consider that a miracle. You're not supposed to get into Harvard College with GED. That being said, in law school, there are not a lot of miracles. We're gonna have to work on those soft factors with the understanding of what else is going on that's going to help determine the outcome of your application. So those soft factors include your work experience. That can be during college, or it can be during gap years that you take after college, which is probably half and sometimes more at selective schools of the students have at least 1 year of full-time post-college work experience or a different graduate degree. So that experience, or that, let's say you went and did a master's of social work, right? That's something that is a plus on an application, that you have that post-college grown-up world experience before you show up at law school.
Yeah, so right there real quick. So you're usually dealing with 20-something-year-olds as opposed to 30-something-year-olds when they're applying?
I am mostly dealing with 20-somethings rather than 30-somethings, but there are exceptions. And there's people who've gone to law school in their 60s.
Sorry.
That's okay. So other things that you can control, your personal statement. There is at least one, sometimes a few essays that are not that different from the essays that you write to get into a private college or a selective college. So you are going to present yourself and your story in those essays. There's always a personal statement. There's often also a diversity statement if you want to talk about, and diversity is quite broadly defined. If you want to talk about not just your color or ethnicity, but also maybe if you're a first generation student, if your parents were immigrants, if you want to talk, if you're a rural student and maybe that's part of what you're bringing to the table is, your family's all cattle ranchers or something like that. Any of those things can be in the diversity statement. If there's some kind of trouble in your history, then there's going to be an explanation for that. It's called a character and fitness addendum. And that's going to matter a lot where you're talking about and anything, if you were arrested, if you got like a minor in possession drinking ticket, when you were in college, when you were 20, you're going to have to disclose that. Even juvenile record has to be, even if it's sealed, expunged, whatever. If you had a juvenile record, you have to disclose and explain that on your character and fitness. Other soft factors. There are some law schools that interview candidates. So basically all the realistic candidates might come in and have an interview, and outstanding performance there can be helpful. So those are the main things that we're looking at as far as the application. Then there's also, and you have also letters of recommendation from college professors or from employers if you've been out of college for a while. They're not super important, but they're there. The other thing is strategy about the topic I touched on first, which is how does law school fit into the aspiration that you have of how you want to use this law degree. So I'll never forget, had to have been, at least like 12 years ago, I was talking to a student who wanted to be a sports agent and who had GPA and LSAT that was going to get him into schools at like the DePaul level. And I told him, don't go to law school, right? There's a lot of situations where I think probably 50% of the kids going to law school in any given year are not making a good bet. And it's a good bet when you have at least one of the following, preferably several, right? Did you get into a top 10 or top 6 law school, right? Because as we can see from me sitting here today, people, if you get that Harvard law degree, it impresses people in a lot of different fields. You can use it many different ways. That's probably worth paying for. So do you get into a really fancy law school? Do you have a guaranteed job? So this happens sometimes like, well, my goal is to join my uncle's family law practice. All right, great. Absolutely go to law school. If you got a job waiting for you, fabulous. 3, someone else is paying. Either your parents or maybe the law school is paying because they're buying that wonderful LSAT score of yours. Someone else is paying. 4th, if you're in a field where you can't advance without your JD. So I'm working with a student this year who is a paralegal and working in immigration law firm, and very committed to this work. And she cannot progress unless she gets a law degree. That's a very good reason to go. She's already working that field, already knows what it is. And finally, it is that University of Kentucky kind of example that I used. If there's a specific, realistic legal job that you want in a particular location, and you are aware that there's a pipeline from that law school to that job that you want, right? If none of those 5 apply, you probably shouldn't go. And I would say conservatively 50% of all law students every year are not in any of those 5 and probably shouldn't go. Some of them are gonna do okay anyway, but they're making a risky bet. And it's probably not a smart bet. So I think the very first, it doesn't have to be first, but I think the most important thing that I can tell a prospective law student is to be a skeptical customer about whether you should go. And consider the possibility that this is going to be a really risky bet for you. And do that with open eyes and a lot of care and advice.
Yeah, and I love that because I feel like, having a conversation of what you're actually trying to do and what paths you can take, and thinking through what's realistic and what your options are, and what you can attain if you work really hard. I think that's really, really valuable. And I don't think a lot of people, there's some people that I know that, went to law school that thought about all that, and there are a few that haven't. They just thought that that was what you were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And when they graduate, they don't really know where else to go. They didn't have a path kind of laid out and thought through from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And they can end up in a lot of debt without really knowing why they even went. So
Remember, this is non-dischargeable debt. You cannot get rid of it in bankruptcy. It will follow you to your grave. It is Dickensian. I think the system is evil, but that's where we are.
yeah. So yeah, I think that's an important conversation to have, is why do I want to go to law school? What am I going to use it for? What path do I want to take? And what is it really going to take for me to get to what I'm envisioning in my mind? And yeah, I just love that. And, as you can see, there's plenty of possibilities in terms of which directions you can go, as long as you know where you need to be, because
Right.
we're not saying that any of this is not, I hate the word realistic, especially when you're talking about emissions, right? But we're not saying that any of this is not, possible, but you have to know what you're up against. And there's a lot of wisdom, and, you can keep your feet on the ground as you're going through this process. So, that what you're going to get is what we're planning to do.
And none of it has to do with whether or not you're smart, whether or not you're hardworking, or whether or not you'd be an excellent lawyer, right? If those qualities show up in your GPA and LSAT, then you can bank on them. If they don't show up in your GPA and LSAT, the system is not designed to appreciate them. And there's no kindness here.
How long should you be studying for the LSAT?
Take the LSAT very, very seriously. I mean, not only, I can't quantify it, but every LSAT point is worth tens of thousands of dollars, both in scholarship and in possible employment down the road. And so do not economize on the LSAT. If you give yourself a lot of time, you don't necessarily need to spend a year or 2 years studying for the LSAT. However, it would be smart to take a diagnostic test at least a year before you intend to apply, so that if your LSAT score is very disappointing, you have time to give it everything you've got before you take the test for real. And you don't, and this is another difference with the SAT and ACT, they don't necessarily just use your best score. Like for the SAT, it's a pretty good strategy to take it 4 or 5 times. I mean, in a non-COVID world anyway. You don't want to do that with the LSAT. The more elite the school, the more likely they are to have a policy where they look at all of your LSAT scores and potentially average them. So you optimally want to take it once, maybe twice, when you are ready to get your peak score, the best one that you are capable of. And give yourself time to find out what your starting point is with a timed diagnostic, and then figure out what's the best preparation strategy for you. And I realize this is easy to say because I'm not talking about somebody else's money. I'm talking about somebody else's money. It's not coming out of my pocket. But if you find a course or an instructor where it's going to cost you, let's say $3,000 to $5,000 to have a higher chance of bringing up your LSAT score, that could save you tens of thousands. And the problem is that it isn't a guarantee. I mean, you can hire the best tutor in the world and your score cannot move very much. But LSAT preparation is a good area to invest with very high potential payoff in terms of a lot more scholarship money if you can get even a few points higher. So give yourself time to understand where you're starting from and figure out a plan to maximize. Most people will have a kind of a natural cap, right? Everybody is going to improve with effort and time. But if your initial score is a 150, it's very unlikely you can get into the 170s. It can be done, but leave yourself a year if you're going to try and do that. If your first cold score is a 165, so the prediction of what your maximum possible score is going to be different.
How do we find you, Hanna?
So you can Google me. I'm Hanna Stotland. My last name is like the country Scotland, but with a T. I'm Hanna at hannastotland.com if you want to email me. But just if you Google probably Hanna and college admission, you may well find me. But my website is hannastotland.webs.com.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to close out the webinar. Thank you so much, Hanna, for your time and your expertise. Guys, if you us, and we'll be back soon on crisis management.
Fabulous. Love to talk about this. Hope to see you again.